Last Friday, the US military put out one of the most boring-sounding press releases you will ever read. No big words, no drama, just numbers. But if you actually stop and look at those numbers, you will see something that might be one of the most damaging blows. Iran has taken in this entire war. 30 ships turned away, 2 ships shot at until they stopped moving, 2 more boarded and searched, and almost nobody talked about it. On July 31st, US Central Command released a short update. It read like something written for a filing cabinet, not for the public. It said American forces had redirected 30 commercial ships trying to break through the naval blockade around Iran. It said 2 ships were disabled after they refused to follow orders. And it said 2 more were boarded so sailors could check their cargo and paperwork by hand. That is the entire statement. No big claims, no warnings, just a quiet list of numbers. Most news channels barely touched it. A few outlets mentioned it deep inside a longer story about the war. But here is why that is a mistake. 30 ships turned away in a single stretch is not a small thing. It means the United States Navy is not just patrolling the water near Iran. It is actively hunting down ships one at a time, stopping them before they can deliver anything, and doing it again and again without stopping. Before going any further, it helps to understand why this stretch of water matters so much in the first place. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow passage of ocean between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. At its tightest point, it is only about 33 kilometers wide. That is not very wide at all. You could drive across that distance in under half an hour on a highway. And yet, somewhere close to 1/5 of all the oil and fuel that moves around the entire world passes directly through that narrow stretch of water. Think about what that really means. Whoever controls the ships moving through that strip of ocean is not just controlling Iran. They are holding a switch connected to gas prices, shipping costs, and fuel supplies on every continent on Earth. A small stretch of water becomes one of the most powerful pressure points in the whole global economy. That is why a blockade here does not just hurt Iran's government. It reaches into everyday life for people thousands of miles away who have never heard of the Strait of Hormuz. So here is what this video is actually going to walk through. First, how this blockade actually works in real life, not just as an idea, but as ships getting stopped, disabled, and searched one after another. Second, what this kind of pressure is doing to Iran's economy in ways that never show up in a single dramatic video clip. And third, why this slow, quiet naval operation happening mostly out of sight might be doing more long-term damage to the regime than any single airstrike has managed so far. Everything covered in this video comes from official US military statements, major news reporting, shipping trackers that follow vessel movement in real time, and maritime intelligence groups that specialize in tracking exactly this kind of activity. These are not guesses. These are the same sources used by shipping companies, insurance firms, and governments who need to know exactly what is happening in that water before they risk a single vessel near it. So let's actually get into what is happening out there, ship by ship, and why a dry government statement from Friday might be quietly telling us more about the direction of this war than any missile strike has. Picture a warship firing a missile, not to sink a ship, not to kill anyone on board, but to hit one exact spot on a tanker, so precisely that the ship stops moving and nobody gets hurt. That actually happened. And once you understand that moment, you start to understand how strange and controlled this entire blockade really is. To understand why 30 rerouted ships matters, you have to go back to where this blockade actually started. It was not a new idea. The United States first imposed a naval blockade on Iran back on April 13th of this year, right after peace talks in Islamabad fell apart. That first blockade lasted around 2 months, running through the middle of June. It genuinely worked. It choked off a large piece of Iran's ability to move oil in and out through its own ports. Iran responded by declaring the strait completely closed and threatening to attack any ship that tried crossing without permission. Then a ceasefire came, and for about 3 weeks, everything changed. The blockade lifted. Iranian shipping picked back up fast, with tanker tracking firms estimating around 50 million barrels of crude oil exported in June alone. On one single day, they moved 10 million barrels. During that short window, Iran reportedly started charging ships transit fees of up to $2 million each just for safe passage, and in some cases asked to be paid in Chinese currency instead of dollars, a clear attempt to dodge sanctions tied to the US dollar. But that calm did not last. On July 7th, Iran started attacking commercial ships again inside the strait. 1 week later, on July 14th, the United States brought the blockade back, this time aimed at any ship trying to enter or leave Iranian waters at all. Now picture what enforcing that actually looks like day to day, because it is far more hands-on than most people imagine. Just 1 day after the blockade returned, American forces disabled an oil tanker called the MT Belma. They did it by firing Hellfire missiles directly into the ship's smokestack after the crew ignored repeated warnings. Stop and think about that for a second. A missile normally used against tanks and buildings aimed with enough precision to stop a civilian ship without sinking it or killing anyone on board. That is not luck. That takes real control and real restraint. A few weeks earlier, during the first blockade, a fighter jet launched from a U.S. aircraft carrier and disabled another tanker, the MT Hosna, by firing cannon rounds straight into its rudder, crippling its ability to steer. That crew had also ignored warning after warning. American forces have boarded ships too, including one called the Wen Yao, where personnel climbed aboard to check cargo, verify paperwork, and confirm the ship's flag actually matched its real ownership. And it is working, at least partly. Independent tracking data has shown clusters of Iran-linked tankers near the edge of the Strait suddenly changing course, making full U-turns, or simply stopping in open water rather than risk crossing the line. Ship captains are visibly recalculating their risk in real time, based on what they have seen happen to other vessels just days earlier. This is not a symbolic show of force. This is the American military firing real weapons at civilian tankers to physically stop them from reaching Iran. And when you add up both stretches of this blockade, the scale becomes hard to ignore. According to figures tied to Central Command, American forces have intercepted 85 vessels total since the blockade first began, seized 3 ships outright, and the U.S. government estimates Iran is losing around $500 million a day in trade because of it. Run that number across just 1 month, and Iran is looking at losses in the range of $15 billion, hitting an economy that was already fragile long before a single missile was ever fired this year. Iran has not just sat back either. It has seized 2 cargo ships of its own in what looks like direct retaliation. But here's the twist. Enforcement, as aggressive as it is, has never been airtight. Shipping intelligence groups estimate around 26 vessels slipped past the blockade entirely during the earlier stretch. And that gap, the space between 85 ships caught and an unknown number that got through anyway, is where the real story actually begins. There are 20,000 people trapped in the middle of this war who never signed up to be part of it. They are not soldiers. They are not fighters. They are ordinary sailors, sitting on cargo ships in open water, watching a war unfold around them that has nothing to do with them at all. During the peak of the blockade earlier this year, maritime officials estimated that around 20,000 seafarers were stranded aboard roughly 3,200 vessels sitting motionless west of the Strait, unable to move forward safely and often unable to turn. Back either. Sit with that number for a second. 20,000 people, roughly the size of a small town, floating in place, waiting. One sailor described his crew boiling water because their fresh drinking supply had already run out, waiting anxiously for word on when a resupply ship might arrive. Another captain, anchored near a major port that had just been hit by a strike, said his real fear was not the war itself, but the idea that if the port shut down completely, there would be no way to evacuate his crew at all. He said 25 of his crew members had already rotated off, leaving 95 people still on board, needing a fresh supply of food and water roughly every 10 to 15 days just to keep functioning. Global shipping organizations have publicly begged flag countries to step in and protect their sailors. At one point, during a brief ceasefire, a temporary humanitarian corridor did open for a few days, letting some of those stranded sailors finally get off their ships. These are ordinary working people, many from places like India, the Philippines, and Eastern Europe, caught in a geopolitical standoff through absolutely no fault of their own. Now, here is why Iran keeps testing this blockade over and over, even as the cost keeps rising. It is not stubbornness, it is survival. Oil is not just part of Iran's economy, it is the foundation the entire economy sits on. Even under years of sanctions, Iran has managed to export around 1.6 million barrels of crude a day recently, a massive jump from just a few 100,000 barrels a day back in 2020. That climb happened almost entirely because of something called the Shadow Fleet, a network of ships built specifically to dodge exactly this kind of pressure. Here is how it actually works. These ships turn off their tracking signals the moment they get near Iranian waters, going dark on purpose. They fly fake flags from countries they have no real connection to, using fake documents built to survive a quick inspection. They meet other ships out in open ocean to transfer oil directly from one tanker to another, blending it with cargo from other sources, so buyers down the line can claim they did not know where it really came from. Analysts estimate Iran operates something like 170 of these ghost ships, and the numbers show just how much this waterway has changed because of them. During one full month of the war, only 292 ships crossed the Strait at all, a tiny fraction of normal traffic, and 71% of those ships were tied directly to Iran or its Shadow Fleet. In the most recent week measured, that number jumped to 88%. This narrow strip of water, one of the most important on the planet, is now mostly filled with ships built specifically to avoid the blockade meant to stop them. The U.S. Navy can disable a tanker's rudder with cannon fire in under 2 minutes. Iran's Shadow Fleet can build a brand new fake shipping registry overnight and have a ship back on the water within days. Neither side is winning this completely, but that constant friction is exactly the point. Every ship forced to zigzag, turn back, or wait weeks for a safe window is a ship not delivering oil on schedule, and a country's economy depends on things arriving on schedule. Here's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this. The United States Navy is, without exaggeration, the most powerful naval force that has ever existed in human history, and it still cannot fully seal off Iran's access to the world's shipping system. Not while China keeps buying Iranian oil, not while fake shipping registries can be built faster than they can be shut down, not while 170 aging tankers can simply go dark and gamble on slipping through unnoticed. That does not mean the blockade is failing. 85 intercepted ships and $500 million a day in losses is a serious blow by any measure. But it does mean this is shaping up to be a long, grinding fight rather than something ended by one dramatic naval action. And treating it any other way sets people up to misunderstand how this part of the war is actually likely to play out. There's a real argument that this blockade, as unglamorous as it looks compared to a bombing campaign, could end up being the single most effective pressure point in this entire war. That is, because it is sustainable in a way that airstrikes are not. You can only bomb a country's military targets so many times before you start running out of new ones to hit, and that gets more expensive the longer a war drags on. A naval blockade does not have that same problem. Ships get turned away or disabled using far cheaper tools than expensive missiles, and the pressure builds day after day instead of resetting between strikes. The trade-off is speed. $500 million a day sounds massive, and it is, but it is also the kind of number that takes months to truly wear a government down, rather than delivering one single dramatic moment that forces an immediate surrender. A leader can point to a strike on a weapons factory and call it a decisive blow the same night it happens, with footage ready for the evening news within hours. Nobody points at one rerouted tanker and calls the war won, even though 30 of them added up over a single week might matter more to how this conflict actually ends. At the same time, the Treasury side of this fight has been working from a completely different angle, and it might end up mattering just as much as the Navy's physical interceptions. Throughout the past year, hundreds of individuals, vessels, and companies tied to sanctions evasion have been targeted, and the pace has only picked up recently, with new rounds specifically aimed at the middlemen who blend and launder Iranian oil into the legitimate market. The goal is not just to punish individual ships anymore, it is to make operating a shadow fleet vessel financially toxic for owners, insurers, and banks alike. If there is one thing worth watching closely going forward, it is China. As long as Beijing keeps buying discounted Iranian crude, despite the sanctions risk, Iran keeps at least one reliable buyer willing to accept the cost of doing business this way. That relationship alone might end up deciding whether this blockade eventually breaks Iran's export economy, or simply reshapes it into something smaller, shadier, and harder to track. A second thing worth watching is whether the overlap between Iran's shadow fleet and Russia's own sanctions evasion network starts drawing more direct attention from European and Asian enforcement agencies, since a shared weak point serving two sanctioned countries at once tends to attract exactly that kind of scrutiny once it becomes obvious. Every number in this video, the 85 ships intercepted, the 30 rerouted just last week, the $500 million a day, comes from the U.S. government's own accounting of its own operation. That does not make these numbers untrustworthy, but it is worth remembering we are largely seeing this blockade through the eyes of the side enforcing it, and Iran's own version of how much trade is actually still getting through would understandably tell a very different story. So here is what to actually watch for next. Watch whether the Treasury's sanctions campaign starts hitting banks and insurers hard enough to scare them away from touching anything connected to Iranian shipping. Watch whether China's buying habits shift at all under pressure. And watch whether the shared shadow fleet infrastructure between Iran and Russia becomes the next major target once enforcement agencies finish mapping it out. Drop a comment and let us know which one of these threads you want followed next, because that is exactly what shapes where this story goes from here.